I noticed too much. It's gotten me in trouble all my life. 40 years ago, I noticed at IBM that most of the promotions were going to people not like me. I quit, started my own company, doing business with the government. And then 15 years later, I noticed that most of the government contracts were going to people who didn't look like me. But I was in a position to retire, so I did, and did what I really wanted to do, which was to teach. And I loved the kids, and the kids loved me, but I made the administrators nervous. I had too much life experience, and I didn't spout the party line. I went back to college, the University College of Education, to learn how to teach. Mistake? They're not interested in teaching you how to teach. They're interested in teaching you how to indoctrinate. They didn't like me there. But in the one semester I was there, I signed up for the most exciting adventure in my life, an anthropology course with the wild Indians in the Amazon River, the Kayapo. In mid-June 2004, we flew 3 hours south to Miami, 10 hours overnight down to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and after a layover, another 3 hours back north to Marabá, Brazil, in the middle of the Amazon. It's on the Tocantins River. You never heard of the Tocantins. It's only 1.5 times as long as the Dnieper, with 6 times as much water. Also 1.5 times as long as the Columbia and the Rio Grande in the United States. You may have heard of those. It's a delightful place. You can sit there and drink beer with your feet in the water on a warm day. We got to know the locals. This lovely lass on the left really wanted to get to know me. She thought I had deep pockets, but she was content to get to know the students as well. After a couple of days in Marabá, we rode south all day down a 2-lane highway to the town of Redenção. Redenção in Portuguese means redemption in English. And if you can picture Redemption, Arizona, with drunk Indians lying on the sidewalks and pockmarks from bullets all over the bank from a daring daylight robbery 2 years ago, you've got Redenção. We spent the night there and flew an hour to the Kayapo Reservation. The 5,000 Kayapo live on 11 million square kilometers. That's 1/6 the size of Ukraine. And the government keeps them there to keep them away from the evil influences of civilization, such as alcohol, and it also protects the wilderness. You see the protected part on the reservation on the bottom of this picture. When we got to the village, the Indians were all dressed up to meet us. Leading the parade was Chiriqui, an 80-year-old former chief. He's looking pretty good for 80 years old. Jungle life has treated him well. Now in the tropics, you don't have to get all dressed up, so dressing up means decoration. Lots of beads, lots of feathers, and body paint. They're big on body paint. We all got body painted. Here are 8 of the 12 students and the professor, Janet Chernela, on the left, professor of anthropology. The Indians didn't know who was in charge. They reasoned. They can't be Janet the anthropologist or Barbara the snake lady. They're women. You can't have a woman chief. Can't be any of the other men. They're too young. It had to be me. So they assumed I was the chief of the white tribe, and they would later give me a name, Kangrare. Come to that. The government had built them houses in their village of Aukre when they settled there in 1967. Plain wooden houses, the first permanent dwellings they'd ever had, around the men's house in the center. With nobody getting involved in Indian wars anymore, the guys my age had lost relatives, uncles and fathers, to the Indian wars, but 50 years nothing had happened. And with a resident nurse from the Brazilian Ministry of Health, the population exploded. So after 2 nights in Aukre village, we went into the jungle itself with 5 older Indians who knew the jungle and had enough Portuguese to communicate with us. These guys were going to be our professors to teach us how things worked in the jungle. At the Kuben-i research station, 80 square kilometers in the middle of the Amazon. We traveled all south all day by dugout canoe. Now, in a concession to modernity, they did have an outboard motor instead of paddles, but it was a real dugout cut from one large log. The next morning, they led us on a long walk through the forest to familiarize us with the Amazon. It was beautiful. And it came out that in addition to being by far the oldest student there, I was the only one who spoke Portuguese. And the Indians had a little fun with me. When we stopped for lunch, they asked, "Where's the project?" In other words, where did we come from? And I said, "Back there." And they said, "Ha ha ha ha, it's over there, silly." And I thought about it and said, "No, it's over there." You see, we followed logging trails that had been put down 2 decades back when they sold their prime mahogany. The first one was straight, so we had walked 2 hours with the sun at our back. The sun's in the north, in the southern hemisphere during winter. And then we turned left and went along another straight road for an hour, which would be east. So I pretty much knew where we were. And the Indians were impressed that I would talk back to them, and they gave me the name Kangrare after some long dead warrior. They gave me a mentor, Ukururu. 2 days later, Ukururu and I were at the tail end as we went single file down a jungle trail. And he motioned to me, "Kangrare, this way." So while the rest of them disappeared around the bend, he and I ran off through the underbrush. Actually, in a triple canopy forest, there isn't much underbrush. It was pretty easy. In 15 minutes, we came across what looked like a trail. He said, "Sit down." So we sat down. And 5 minutes later, the rest of the party came around the bend and encountered us sitting in the path. Ukururu thought this was hilariously funny. He split a gut laughing. I had to laugh too. Later that week, Ukururu and I were walking, and he took my arm and he said, "Kangrare, puerco," pigs. I said, "Where? Pigs?" He said, "Over there, see them?" I looked. I didn't see anything. He was disappointed. He said, "Hear them? White-lipped peccary go chatter with their teeth when they're eating." I didn't hear anything. He said, "Well, can't you smell them? Pigs." couldn't smell a thing. I'd make a damn poor Indian. Now, he took time to explain how they used to hunt when he was a kid. If a party of Indians came across some pigs like this, 2 of them would stay back, and the rest would circle around downwind of the pigs and take up positions behind big trees on the game trails they knew that the pigs followed. When everything was in place, the 2 who were left behind would start yelling and screaming, scare the pigs. The pigs would go tearing off down the game trails, and as they passed the big trees, they'd step out with the clubs and go bang, hit them over the head. It's a hard way to get your meat, but it worked. The Kayapo didn't even have bows and arrows. Now, part of our work as anthropology students was to talk to the Indians about how they lived. So we had interviews, and we asked them about the medicinal and nutritional uses of flowers, bark, fruits, and so on of the vegetation that grew around there. So we conducted these interviews through translators. Here's a translator. And I have to say that given the general level of knowledge of the students and the problems of translation, it wasn't terribly fruitful as far as what we learned, but it was interesting. It was an introduction to what anthropologists do. With me, it went the other way, and this scared the anthropologists. And the Indians asked me about my life. He said, "Contrary, where do you live? Now, you have a house?" "Yes, I have a house." "How big?" 500 square meters. "Ooh." "You have a car?" "Yes." 4 of them. "Ooh." But on the other hand, I turned it back to them. I said, "How often do you guys get sex?" "As often as we want it, pretty much." "And how much work do you do?" "What's work?" There are 2 sides to every question. On one of our walks through the woods, we came to a waterfall in the middle of the wilderness with this lovely pool. If you look closely, you see one of our students swimming in the pool. A couple of us noticed a snake behind that waterfall, a big snake. Now, I could tell by looking at it that it wasn't poisonous because it was too big to be a member of the cobra family. The coral snake's the only one that it might have been. And it didn't have a triangular head, so it wasn't a pit viper. So I was kind of game to go after it, but Barbara, the snake lady, said, "No, no, no, it's all mine," and she grabbed it. So here she is with a snake. I asked her if she knew what kind it was, and she didn't even know what family it was in. And she wasn't surprised that she didn't know, because there's an awful lot of the Amazon that's simply not categorized yet. Traditional fishing in the Kayapo was as primitive as their hunting. They would gather in a circle where the river was shallow and gradually close the circle, scaring the fish toward the center. When they had got them close enough, they would throw a tree sap on the water, which deprived the water of oxygen, and the fish would come to the surface to get some oxygen, and they'd grab the fish and throw them off to the riverbank. Once again, not a terribly efficient way to fish, but it fed them. Now all that has changed. It's only the old guys my age who had memory of doing that, and they use modern fishing tackle, which is very efficient. They would clean the fish at the dock. There's a little dock where we tied up our dugout, and throw the heads and the guts to the caiman who lived there. A caiman is a fish-eating crocodile. This guy was only about 1.5 meters long. He was kind of a pet. He wasn't dangerous. I saw the Indians swimming in the same water with the caiman. They didn't worry about him, and he didn't worry about the Indians. So I did the same, and I found that I could get within a couple of meters of this caiman, and he didn't budge at all. He wasn't bothered. As I was swimming in the water, I did see some dangerous stuff. I'd go under some trees that were bent over the water, and I saw vampire bats on the bottom side of the trees waiting for nightfall. They were dangerous. We slept in tents so the vampires wouldn't bite us. We could afford the loss of blood, but they sometimes carry rabies. Incidentally, I was the only student who swam who had faith that the Indians knew what they were doing. Here's a caiman with a big smile on his face. That's a crocodile smile after a meal of fish. The river also had piranha, which likewise didn't bother the Indians. They fished for the piranha. Now you can see that they have nasty teeth, but they didn't attack the Indians. It was quite the other way around. On our next to last day there, we did something we'd been talking about since we arrived. We went to the top of Monkey Head Mountain. Monkey Head Mountain was the only real hill in the area, rising maybe 500 meters above the plain, 500, less than 500. And from it we could see a long, long ways, as you can see by this picture. 8 of us set out, half men, half women. Well, the other 3 men were smokers and not in terribly good shape, and they crapped out halfway up and went back to the camp. But the women stayed with it, and Irio, one of the Indians, and I were the first ones to get to the top. And when we got there, Irio wanted to play a joke on one of the other Indians who was down below in the camp, still within earshot, apparently. He said, "Compadre, please shout as loud as you can, Kuben-i." It turns out that Kuben-i was one of the Indians down below, a round-faced fellow, married, father, but round-faced, baby face. And they wanted to make fun of him. The le suffix is diminutive. Makes him sound like a woman. So I did my part and yelled out, "Kuben-i" a couple of times. And Irio and the other Indian, I think it was Bastien, who was with us, broke out laughing. They have their own sense of humor. Now let's talk about more serious subjects. This is an inadequate schoolhouse for Ukre. Talking about teaching, the knowledge of the older guys that we were with isn't worth much anymore in the forest. They get their medicines from the Brazilian nurse. They don't need their traditional knowledge for hunting pigs. They use shotguns. They don't need traditional knowledge for fishing. They use fishing rods. The young people spend their time playing video games, and they're really rather dissolute. They don't have much purpose in life. There aren't any challenges on the path to adulthood anymore. They don't have to learn jungle skills, and they don't have to learn how to fight, because the government doesn't let them get in wars anymore. So what's an education for the Indians? If you try to teach them the things we teach in our schools, you would have to teach in Portuguese, because Kayapo doesn't have a written language, and there wouldn't be any books anyhow, and there wouldn't be any teachers. So you'd have to teach them in Portuguese. But then, how would they use an education? There's nothing you can do with it on the reservation. They'd have to go to town. So education really has no place on a reservation. The chiefs don't support it because if you got them educated and they went to town, you'd lose your Indians. Nonetheless, the Brazilian educational authorities offered to send a teacher into the village of Aucre. But the Indians were a proud people and they said, no, can't do that. We don't have an adequate schoolhouse. A schoolhouse is made out of brick with a tin roof. This is not a schoolhouse. So whether or not they could have used an education, they turned it down on them as a matter of principle. And that's as good an excuse as any. The Portuguese Jesuits started trying to educate the Indians 5 centuries ago. It has never really worked. A Brazilian educator said, what would you do? You would take the princes of the forest and make them peasants on the sidewalks of Manaus. And that's pretty much what would happen. Indian education has been a failure among all 40 million Indians throughout the Americas, for the most part. Which raises a question, what's their future? I left with the impression that I was witnessing a slow motion catastrophe. The Kayapo are perfectly evolved for their current environment, but that environment won't last. Brazilian society is pressing in on all sides. Somebody's going to want those 11 million square kilometers. And the Kayapo themselves want things that money will buy, such as shotguns and fishing rods and this and that. They cannot resist civilization. The two will clash and will not turn out well for the Indians. I feel I was extremely lucky to see this civilization at a point in time because I don't think it's going to last. This paradise will disappear in a couple of generations, maybe a couple of decades. This is my conclusion. As I noted in the beginning, I noticed too much. The anthropologists don't like this conclusion. They and the non-governmental organizations that are all over the place are supporting the Indians in their fight against modernity and their fight against encroachment. And they're having a pretty good battle, but it's a rear guard battle. They'll never gain, they can just slow progress. It was a beautiful, beautiful experience and a sad one. As I said, I noticed too much. Madam Toastmaster.